In Europe these days, there's a tremendous social struggle against what they call austerity there. It is the policy of many European governments, particularly in peripheral countries like Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Hungary, where the government, in a fiscal jam because of the global capitalist crisis, feels that it has to cut down on its borrowing, it has to shrink its economy, and it does so by laying off public employees and cutting public services. Here in the United States, we don't call it austerity all that much, but we are doing the same thing. Whether it's in a dramatic form like the states of Florida and Wisconsin are doing these days, laying off public employees, taking away their collective bargaining rights, cutting back social services, or even at the highest levels of our government in Washington, where there are serious propositions to savagely cut the Medicaid program that helps the poor with their medical expenses, or even Social Security and Medicare for the older citizens of the United States. But there is something extraordinarily important that differentiates the United States from Europe. First of all, the standard of government services and supports for people in Europe is far in advance of that in the United States. And even the proposals to cut it, which you have there now, and the struggles are happening in a situation where they would have a long way to go in their cutting to even approach what we already have. Let me give you some examples. Every major European country has a national health service, including Great Britain, that provides an enormous and much greater than here array of government-supported medical care. Most of them have most of their school students in public schools. The role of private education in Europe is much, much more limited than here. And education is subsidized. To go to a public school in most European countries costs you very, very little, way less than what the United States has, particularly at the college and university levels. Here's some more examples. It's the law in many European countries that every employer, private employer, must give his or her employees several weeks of vacation. France has 5 weeks of mandatory paid vacation for all workers. And on and on and on it goes. In France, they subsidize bread, which is much cheaper there than here. They subsidize children. If you have more than one child, you get a government subsidy per child, and so on. Well, here's an interesting thought. Despite the fact that the social services in Europe are much more developed and generous than they are here, and despite the fact that the economic crisis hurt the Europeans less in the way of unemployment or foreclosure than it did here, when the Europeans tried modestly to cut their generous social program, it produced enormous mass demonstrations against austerity. Some of the biggest demonstrations Europe has seen in 50 years. General strikes of all workers in Germany, in Portugal, in Spain, in France, and elsewhere. Last September 29th, 2010, a coordinated European-wide general strike in which virtually every country participated. It's extraordinary. And it has led to people asking, inside the United States and in Europe, why, by comparison, in the United States, where the need for social support from the government is greater, and where the damage done in the current crisis is also greater, why hasn't there been a correspondingly greater fight back by the mass of people? And here's the answer. Over the last 50 years, in the United States, the kinds of organizations that could have informed and mobilized Americans to fight against the attack on their social benefits, on the government's social program, on the government's employment, and now literally on the right to strike. The organizations that would have fought for that were allowed to die slowly or not so slowly. So we don't have, compared to 50 years ago, anything like the trade union movement that we once had. Today in the United States, 6.9% of private employees are in a union. That means 93.1% of private employees, the vast majority of our employees in America, are not in and are not represented by a trade union. That is a severe drop Once upon a time, we had a third of our workers in unions. So the unions have shrunken, become much weaker. We once had socialist and communist parties in America who fought for these benefits just as they now do in most of the European countries. We let those institutions and parties and organizations die. So here we are, 2011, and what's different between Europe and us? They didn't let those institutions die. Their trade unions are strong. Their socialist and communist parties, even if they're not as strong as they once were, are still powerful. And indeed, they've generated new big parties, green parties, anti-capitalist parties, and so on. Those together are huge percentages of their population. But more important than that, they are organizations that can and do mobilize people to make sure that politics doesn't just serve corporations and rich individuals. They push in the same direction as here, those rich people and those corporations. But they can't get so far because of the organized resistance they face. We have resistance in America, but it's not organized. And therein is a lesson that we should all learn.